Hello, Space Unicorns! Welcome to the Uncanny Magazine podcast, episode 69B. I am Michael Damian Thomas, the publisher and editor-in-chief of Uncanny Magazine. It is April! So this is one of those weird things. Sometimes, because we launch on the first Tuesday of the month, sometimes it's like, yay, it's like the first, and sometimes like you've already lived through a week of April. Though granted, I think the first week of April for many of us has felt like many, many weeks. But here we are, spring is sprung here in central Illinois. The Fighting Illini of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign are in the Final Four. That will have already happened by the time you hear this podcast, but I do not know yet. There are many things I do not. I'm actually not a huge college basketball fan, but it's a thing going around, in this town, and a lot of excitement about it, along with flowers and cherry blossoms at Japan House and all the things that say, hey, it's spring. It's a time for new beginnings, new starts, new amazing, wonderful things happening. And this is a very big April for me, Space Unicorns. So yeah, so hopefully wherever you are also having some good things happen to you, and you're seeing some beauty out there and beauty around you. And no matter how terrible it all is, you're together and you have people who you love and people who love you. And now, our news. More fabulous news, Space Unicorns. The Life and Times of Elvira the Great, as written by Titos Pavlou and reviewed by two lifelong friends by Evgenia Triantafilou, is also a finalist for the British Science Fiction Association Award for Best Short Fiction. Congratulations to Evgenia and to all of the finalists. So, Space Unicorns, by the time you listen to this podcast, you will know who have won the BSFA awards, and so hopefully some awesome things have won. I know awesome things will win, because there's many wonderful things that are finalists, so yay, awards! And now, a word from our sponsor.
Get ready for LACon 5, the 84th World Science Fiction Convention. Join fans, writers, and creators from around the galaxy for 5 days of panels, cosplay, and unforgettable fandom at the Anaheim Convention Center, August 27th to 31st, 2026. See you in the future.
And welcome back, Space Unicorns. In this episode, we feature the short story, The Woman Who Stole Flowers by Theodora Goss, The Truth About Wolves by Marissa Lingen, and finally, I interview Theodora Goss. Well, when I was talking to Theodora Goss for the interview, it was suddenly reminded me we've known each other for, between 15 and 20 years, a long time. And Dora is just one of the most amazing, wonderful writers, just lyrical, gorgeous stories and poems, and it is always such a joy to work with her. And this story in particular, it is delightful. The title of it really reveals quite a bit of what the story is about, which is handy dandy. And it is a big hug of a story. It is fun, it is interesting, it's intriguing, and I think you're all going to very much enjoy it. So now, The Woman Who Stole Flowers by Theodora Goss, as read by Erika Ensign.
She just tore it right up out of the planter. It was not a violent tearing. The soil was loose enough to release the plant, some of it coming up with the roots, so that as she held the green clump, some sort of hosta in bloom, with its purple trumpets waving on green stalks above her fist, the dirt sifted down as a fine brown dust. She was one of the smallest women I have ever seen. Blue jeans hanging in a way that implied a pair of legs as skinny as a stork's, and over them some sort of plaid dress that had probably come from a charity shop, and, on top of that, the raveling edge of a sweater under a puffed jacket. She was dressed for winter, even though it was already spring, and time for the hostas to bloom. And a long scarf, probably hand-knitted by the look of it, and a hat that was also knitted but did not match, in a completely different color, on her small head, with her white hair hanging out beneath it, all the way down her back, unbrushed. I did not see her face. She held up the plant, then put it in a plastic shopping bag where she kept, I presumed, the rest of her floral loot. Thief, I thought. You should be in some sort of botanical jail. Why are you walking around the city, toddling would have been more accurate, stealing plants out of their planters? Do you also steal them out of parks? Did the police ever catch you? I did not want to confront her, in part because I could not think of how to say, "Why are you stealing plants from the planter in front of my apartment building?" in Hungarian. The language twists my brain into pretzels anyway. And here, it was already twisted by this diminutive plant thief. So, that day, at least, I did nothing but gape at her in a disbelieving way. But I saw her again, and then again. She did indeed steal plants out of public parks, and seemingly with impunity. I watched her steal blue vinca minor, also called periwinkles, from the park around the Nemetzi Museum, or National Museum in English, pulling out the long vines with their roots. The next time, it was flowering Alchemilla mollis from Cadway Kert, which translates to Cadway Garden, because it was once the back garden of a palace owned by an aristocratic family of that name. Now, it has a central lawn of green grass where dogs are not allowed, a fountain surrounded by lavender bushes and the soft silver leaves of artemisia, a children's playground with swings, and an elaborate climbing structure. I wondered what the aristocratic Cataways would think. Anyway, there she was, in another sweater, wearing another jacket, lighter this time and the bright orange of a traffic cone, with another hat and scarf. But otherwise, just the same. Into her plastic bag she stuffed the Alchemilla mollis, and then newly planted violas, the ones with purple petals surrounding a yellow eye. Do you remember The Elephant's Child from Kipling? It got into trouble because of its insatiable curiosity. I have the same character flaw, as well as a long nose that I really should keep out of anyone else's business. But I could not help it. So far, I had only seen my flower thief coincidentally, but after several such sightings, I started looking for her and following her when I could. Inconspicuously, surreptitiously, I always gave up when I was afraid she might see me or notice my attempt at botanical espionage, but she never did notice, at least as far as I could tell. She seemed completely incurious about her surroundings. She just gathered her flowers. One weekday, partly to avoid the research that was waiting for me back at my rented apartment, I followed her, and followed her, longer than I had ever followed her before. That day, she carried her plastic bag, growing heavier with each flower theft, down the streets of Józsefváros, which is the district where I lived, filled with glorious examples of 19th century architecture, half gentrified with fancy coffee shops, half covered with Soviet-era soot that has never been cleaned off the crumbling plaster. It is my favorite part of Budapest, and elegant if you consider fallen grandeur elegant, which I do. I had been following her since I first spotted her that morning, in front of an Italian cafe where you can get tiramisu and those dry almond cookies, pulling up the stems of crimson and purple Sweet William from a planter. The strange thing was that she never stopped at the places where a Hungarian néni, or elderly woman, would stop on her daily rounds. She did not go to the butcher, or baker, or to the greengrocer. No, she just collected plants, toddling down one narrow street after another on her thin stork legs, with her blue jeans puddling around a pair of dingy tennis shoes. Finally, she came to a building with a sort of large, arching front doorway common in Budapest, which used to let carriages drive into a central courtyard. She turned and went in, so suddenly that I almost lost her. It was one of the soot-covered buildings, probably the sootiest I had ever seen, as though it carried within its pores the memory of all the Trabants and Yugos that had driven down that narrow little street in the Soviet era. Its windows were still in the old style, a previous century's idea of insulation, an outer window and beyond it an inner one, so that to get fresh air you had to open both. Perhaps in that century there had been fresh air in Budapest. The wavy old glass reflected the buildings across the street as though they were under water, and the paint on the frames was peeling. I looked through the large doorway, down the corridor where carriages had driven, and into what was indeed a central courtyard. Did I dare follow her? I waited for a few minutes, telling myself that only madmen and detectives went around following other people, and I wasn't a detective, so what did that make me? Then, in my madness, because my curiosity had turned into a kind of obsession. I dared. The corridor smelled of stale bread and cabbages. To my left was a staircase winding upward in an ancient lift. The courtyard beyond it was just a slab of broken concrete. In one corner were the requisite trash and recycling bins, blue for paper and yellow for plastics. Next to them was an old bicycle, rusted. There was no one in the courtyard. From the shadow of the corridor, I looked around to make sure none of her neighbors were watching me, then upward. All around the inside of the building, on the second and third floors, counting American style with the ground floor as the first, because I am always confused by the European system in which the ground floor doesn't have a number, ran long, narrow balconies, like outdoor corridors. Along those balconies were the doors to the inner apartments, the ones which looked into the courtyard rather than onto the street. I could tell which door was hers. There, on the third floor, one entire side of the building had been turned into a garden. Along the metal railing, the balcony was lined with pots, and from those pots grew plants. Some of them twined around the metal of the railing, so that the railing itself seemed to be sprouting leaves and blooming in such profusion that half the balcony, at least, was obscured. One clematis had grown so large and dense that its vines hung down from the railing, like purple stars waving over the second-floor balcony below. Plants had been hung from brackets or trained to grow up the wall. She had turned the balcony into a green alley, and all of it was in bloom. At the end of the balcony was a door that I presumed led to her apartment, the highest and hardest to reach in the building. The windows, or what I assumed were her windows, were covered, as old Hungarian women's windows are always covered, by lace curtains. So that was it. Mystery solved. Here lived an old woman who had wanted to create a garden for herself in the city of Budapest, but being a pensioner, she had no money to buy plants, so she had stolen them. That was all. I looked at my watch. It was late afternoon, and I had spent almost the entire day following her. But I had my own work to do. I was on sabbatical from an American university, during which I was supposed to research changes in the Hungarian educational system in the post-Soviet era. I should have spent the day writing an article, not following a harmless, if botanically larcenous, old woman around the streets of Budapest. It was time to get back to my own rented apartment, the corner of my bedroom that I had designated as a home office, the articles I had saved online. And yet, I stood there for a few more minutes. As I stood, not quite waiting, what was there to wait for, the door of her apartment opened. She stepped out, carrying a large watering can. It was her, same baggy jeans, same plaid dress, now under a shapeless cardigan that hung over her frame, same white hair. But now, it hung like a waving curtain down her back, and she could not have been older than 20, 30. She was young. She moved like a young woman. She was strong enough to lift what looked like a heavy metal can filled with water. She walked among the plants, watering them, leaning down to inspect them, almost as though she were having a conversation with each one. She could have been the daughter or even the granddaughter of the woman I had been following, except that she was wearing the same clothes, and her hair was still white, and there was something about her movements, a kind of bird-like delicacy that had distinguished my flower thief. I watched her water the plants all along that balcony, then go back into the apartment with her watering can and shut the door. And that was that. I waited another 10 or 15 minutes, but she did not come out again. On Friday, I was supposed to have coffee with my friend Dr. Szabó Magda, which in the American system would be Magda Szabó. In names, as in many other things, Hungarians do things differently than the rest of Europe. And not just differently, but in opposition to, as though proudly, even obstinately other. We met in the Nemetzi Museum, where she had her main office. The other is in Eötvös-Loránd University, where she teaches in the archaeology department. We went down to the basement cafe and ordered coffee. I also ordered a slice of cake, chocolate with layers of raspberry jam. In Budapest, no matter where you go, the cake is generally excellent, and I always order it when I can. I have a strange story to tell you, I said, after we had exchanged pleasantries. For academics, pleasantries consist of talking about the conferences you most recently attended and complaining about the state of higher education funding. And then I told her about my flower thief. The thing is, I said after a mouthful of chocolate ganache, I don't know much about flowers, but I'm pretty sure they weren't supposed to be flowering. Not all of them. I mean, not all of them at once. That's not how it works. I may not know much about flowers, but my mother is an avid gardener. Her own parents fled Hungary after the Second World War with their 2 young daughters, and she grew up in an American suburb. But somehow, she inherited an ancestral gene for planting and growing things. So, while I was growing up, everything flourished in our suburban garden. My Aunt Judith, by contrast, inherited the embroidery gene, and flowers grow riotously across her linen canvases. There, they flower all together, like in my flower thief's balcony garden. I am neither a gardener nor an embroiderer, but I vaguely remembered that every plant has its season, and clematis would not flower at the same time as lavender, for example. And yet, in that balcony garden, I was fairly certain that all the plants had, improbably, been flowering together. Magda is one of the most practical people I know. She has the same short haircut my mother has, a style that is not a style, and a face wrinkled by the sun of archaeological digs. She is typically Hungarian. She complains about the government, lives in an apartment she inherited from her grandparents, who moved there during the 1930s, and cooks a miraculous goulash soup, although she says her mother's was much better. When you talk, she looks at you as though she is really listening. "Go on," she said, and took another sip of her coffee. Her English, learned in a Hungarian high school and perfected during a Fulbright at UCLA, has a faintly Californian flavor on top of her basic Hungarian accent. "There isn't any on to go," I said. "That's it. That's all I know about her. She's an old woman who somehow also looks young, although maybe I just wasn't seeing her clearly, and the plants in her garden seem to be flowering all at once, although, again, maybe that was just my imagination. Maybe I'm going a little crazy? Do I look a little crazy to you, Mugdy? What is Professor Szabó's verdict?" Magda looked at me intently for a moment, then drank the last of her coffee. "It is, of course, possible that you're going crazy. We're all mad here, right? Especially in Hungary. Have I told what the government is doing now to the universities? There is a new law. Nope, I don't even want to talk about it. Tell me again about your flower woman. What did she look like?" So, I described her again for Magda. She frowned, and a little V formed between her eyebrows, like geese flying in formation. "Your description reminds me of something," she said. "Come on, I want to show you." I finished the last bite of my chocolate cake, then returned my plate and fork to the counter. "All right, I'm ready," I said. "What do you want to tell me?" I said show you, not tell you about it. She was already waiting impatiently at the entrance to the coffee shop. "Come on." I had never been in the private spaces of the Nemecy Museum before. Magda led me through a door behind the coffee shop that said, "Tilos Belepni." No entrance, museum staff only. The private parts of the museum are not as fancy as the public spaces. Here, there were no marble columns rising up to frescoed ceilings. We walked by dimly lit offices, including one with Dr. Szabó Magda on the wall plaque, until we came to a door covered with an iron grill. Drawing a bunch of keys out of her tooled leather bag, which looked as though it had gone through several archaeological digs with her, Magda unlocked the grill, and then the door behind it. The grill looked modern. The door behind it looked as though it had survived from the 19th century. "This is the main storage area," she said. And it was. High metal shelves were piled with stuff. All the stuff that doesn't get displayed on a regular basis. Ceramics and textiles, glassware and metalwork, pieces of furniture. All neatly cataloged, rising to the ceiling like books in university library stacks. It was like walking through a library of Hungarianness through the centuries. As I marveled at glimpses of Turkish armor and Habsburg memorabilia, Magda led me through the shelves to one corner of the room. It was a somewhat dark, dingy corner. with what were obviously bits of Roman statuary. "Welcome to Pannonia," she said. As you may know, the Roman province of Pannonia once covered what is the Carpathian Basin, from Budapest into Austria and down into Slovenia, Croatia, and Serbia. It was originally conquered by Augustus and subsequently fought over by a succession of emperors until it was finally ceded to Attila and his Huns in 433 AD. You can still see the remains of Pannonia in Hungary. There are Roman ruins under some of the Budapest metro stations, and farmers in the countryside regularly dig up coins or bits of armor. Builders of new vacation homes around Lake Balaton may come across what were originally the foundations of vacation homes for Roman nobility. For the Romans, Pannonia was a source of military recruits, hunting dogs, and a barley beer they called Sabea. They tried to hold on to it as long as they could before internal troubles made it easier to cede it to the barbarians. Magda stooped down and searched on the lowest shelf, behind what looked like a pair of broken garden urns. It seemed as though what she was searching for had been placed all the way in the back. "Do you need help?" I asked. She did not look very comfortable, crouched down with her head stuck under the shelf above, on which I could see a stone dog that had probably once guarded a tomb. On his pedestal was written, "Cave Canem." "I've got it," came her muffled answer. She emerged, a little dusty, holding a terracotta statue. "Here it is," she said, looking grimly triumphant. "Perhaps I should start going to yoga classes. My knees are too old for this." The statue was small, about the size of a doll you might give your niece. It was not particularly sophisticated for Roman work. I could see why it had been stuck on a shelf instead of displayed in the museum. It seemed rude and rustic, a product of the provinces, created by a peasant potter rather than a more sophisticated import from Rome. The statue was of a woman, wearing a long dress with a skirt shaped like a church bell. Her hair was coiled around her head in an elaborately braided style, over which she wore a crown of flowers. She held her arms out stiffly to the sides, and in each of her hands were flowers as well. Around the hem of her dress were piled more flowers, so that you could not see her feet. The statue still bore traces of paint. Once her dress must have been blue, and the flowers in her hair and hands, and at her feet, must have been multicolored, like real flowers. "She comes from Aquincum," said Magda. "She should be in the museum there, but they did not have space for her. They wanted to display their best items, and this little Flora, well, you can see it's not the best example of Pannonian craftsmanship." Aquincum was a Roman town that is now in a suburb of Budapest. You can take a commuter train there to visit the ruins, next to a shopping center. There is also a small museum filled with artifacts excavated in the vicinity. On holidays, the museum arranges not particularly accurate recreations of Roman life, as well as crafts for sale and games for the children. I went once and had some very good, but not at all Roman, sour cherry retesh. "She's supposed to be a statue of Flora?" I said. "You can still see it written faintly on the base," said Magda. "Here." She showed me, scratched faintly into the terracotta, "Flora," among the flowers heaped around the hem of her dress. We think she was probably a garden statue of some sort, set in a shrine because the weather hasn't damaged her too badly. But look. Magda turned the statue around. The back of the statue was another statue, with the same dress, the same flowers, but another face. She was indeed like a doll, one of those cloth dolls you can flip over to find another doll underneath. Even in the dim light, I could see that this face was very different from the one in front. She was still dressed in her bell-shaped skirt. She still had her elaborate braids and flower crown, still carried flowers in her hands. Flowers were still heaped at her feet, but she looks old. It was hard to tell on the weathered terracotta face, but it seemed to have been intentionally sculpted to look like an old woman. The Romans' most important contribution to art was imperfection. The Greeks learned how to represent the perfection of the gods. The Romans learned how to present humanity with all its flaws, age, disease, even death. They showed us emperors and slaves, gladiators and dwarves, even the group least represented in statuary, old women. This, despite the flowers in her hair and the crudity of the representation, was clearly an old woman. A young woman and an old woman. Two sides of one goddess. Why? I asked. I mean, isn't Flora the goddess of flowers? She's not supposed to have two faces. Apparently, some people thought she did, said Magda. We've only found 3 of these statues, one more from Aquincum, and one from Brigetio, which is now the town of Comarom. Have you been there? No? It has a very good thermal bath. She turned the statue back and forth, so I could see both faces. Young, old. Young, old. This is one of the best preserved. Putting a statue in a garden is not the best way to preserve it, as you can imagine. But what does it mean? I asked. Why does she have 2 faces? I suppose because Flora is the goddess of youth, rejuvenation, rebirth. Perhaps that also makes her the goddess of age, decline, and even death. We don't really know, said Magda. I asked colleagues in Italy if they had ever seen a Flora like this one. I sent them some photos attached to an email, and they said no. They have a lot more garden floras, and theirs are all young women. But I'll tell you what I think. You usually do. She put the Flora statue back on the shelf, but this time in front of the 2 garden urns, with its older face turned outward. At least Flora will be able to see something now, I thought. What I think is there must have been some sort of goddess here already, a goddess of gardens and flowering plants. Maybe a goddess that grew old and then young again, or something similar. She could have had some sort of seasonal significance. There are such goddesses in many mythologies. Anyway, here come the Romans, and they do what they always do. They just graft their gods onto the most similar gods of the local pantheon. So this seasonal goddess became the Roman Flora. That sort of thing happened all over the Roman Empire. It was one of the reasons the empire remained stable for so long. No religious wars. If the Romans saw that your tribe already had its own gods, they just decided your gods were versions of Jupiter or Mars or Minerva, etc. Your gods were versions of Jupiter or Mars or of Minerva, etc. She smiled and added, they collected the gods the way some people collect stamps. But what about this local goddess? The one that became Flora. Do we know anything about her? I stared at the Flora statue, and she stared, not back at me, but in the general direction of my knees. Not as far as I know. The tribes that inhabited this area before the Romans didn't leave written records. I think they were Dacians, Dalmatians, Sarmatians. Don't quote me. This is nowhere close to my area of expertise. The Magyars didn't come until later. The important thing is that we really don't know. I wish I could tell you more, Juji, her Hungarian way of saying Susie. But this doesn't explain your old woman anyway, does it? Probably you didn't see her that well, or maybe she has a granddaughter who happens to have blonde hair that looked white in the sunshine. Or she could bleach her hair. Teenagers sometimes do nowadays. And I'm really sorry, but I just realized that I have a meeting in 20 minutes. It's a committee on how we can attract more foreign students. We have to, or we won't survive. Not enough Hungarian students are interested in archaeology nowadays. They want degrees that will get them jobs in Austria or Germany. But let's have coffee again soon, okay? My nearsightedness, or a punk rock granddaughter. Those were the logical explanations for my flower thief. Or maybe I had just imagined that the old woman had somehow become young. Magda was too kind to have mentioned that as a possibility. But I could see she had been thinking it, and it was the most logical explanation of all. I visited her once more, my flower thief. I did not dare steal flowers for her, but I bought potted plants at the market. Pansies, pinks, some potted hyacinths, as many as I could fit into a reusable plastic shopping bag from the grocery chain Spar. I carried them into her building and, making certain no one saw me, I did not want any of the other residents asking me, in rapid Hungarian, what I was doing there. Left them at the top of the stairs, next to the door that opened onto her balcony. They were either a gift to an old Hungarian woman who was clearly too poor to buy her own plants, or a tribute to Flora, goddess of youth and maybe also age, rebirth, and maybe also death. I left the bags as well, folded up between the pots and the wall, then sneaked back downstairs, walked home, and tried to get back to working on my research project. I saw her again a few times, usually around twilight, stealing plants. She would yank them up out of the ground, then put them in a reusable plastic spar shopping bag. Once, in Katoe Kert, I thought she saw me. I was sitting on a bench, sipping an evening cup of takeaway cappuccino in preparation for a late night of revisions. And then I saw her, stooping next to the central bed of flowers, the one that has a sign saying, Tilosh ofudora lebni, meaning, don't step on the grass. She pulled up a specimen of flowering sage, still covered with purple blossoms and probably a few angry bees. She stood up and turned. Then, just for a moment, she seemed to glance in my direction, as though aware of my presence, watching. But I could be mistaken. When my sabbatical was up, I left Budapest and returned to New Hampshire to begin the fall semester at my university. The inevitable round of meeting new students, teaching old classes in a way that makes them feel fresh, writing letters of recommendation for students applying to graduate school. The academic cycle, repeated over and over again since universities began. Sometimes, as I stand in front of a lecture hall, or sit in my office, or stop at the campus Starbucks for what Americans call coffee, I think of her, scuttling around Budapest in her thrift store clothes, 80 or maybe 8,000 years old, and smile to myself. I like to think that I live in a world in which old women continue to steal flowers, and the old gods have not completely passed away from this earth.
Theodora Goss is the world fantasy, locus, and mythopoeic award-winning author of the Athena Club trilogy of novels, starting with The Strange Case of the Alchemist's Daughter. Her other publications include several short stories and poetry collections, including Snow White Learns Witchcraft, The Collected Enchantments, and Letters from an Imaginary Country. She has been a finalist for the Nebula, Crawford, and Shirley Jackson Awards, as well as on the Tiptree Award honor list. Her work has been translated into 15 languages. She is currently a master lecturer in rhetoric at Boston University. And now, our poem, The Truth About Wolves by Marissa Lingen, as read by Matt Peters.
The truth about wolves. They will tell you lies about wolves, my darling, that you contain just two, and can feed only one, and this shapes you. No, not you. You are full of wolves. The whole pack. Tumbling pups, grizzled elders, howling, nipping. You can feed them all. Angry wolf will hunt beside nurturing wolf. They are siblings. They are you. Give them entrails. Give them blood. Let them lick your tears. You need them all. You are a forest. You are the stream and the moon. You need starve nothing that is yourself.
Marissa Lingen is a freelance writer who lives in the Minneapolis suburbs with her family. She is the author of over 200 works of short science fiction and fantasy and has no intention of stopping anytime soon. She also writes essays, poetry, and whatever comes to her next. Her debut novella, A Dubious Clamor, is coming soon from Horned Lark Press. Thank you for joining us on the Uncanny Magazine podcast. Today I'm joined by Theodora Goss, the author of this month's podcast short story, The Woman Who Stole Flowers. Welcome, Dora.
Hi, Michael. It's lovely to talk to you.
It's wonderful to talk to you, too. This is just such a delightful and layered stories with richly developed characters and really memorable moments. What was your starting point or inspiration?
I'm so glad you liked it. So the starting point or inspiration was an actual old woman who really truly was stealing flowers. So I am very, very lucky in that I own an apartment in Budapest. And the way that happened is that I was born in Budapest and my grandparents had this apartment. And eventually my grandparents died and it passed on to my mother. And then my mother decided at one point that she really couldn't take care of the apartment anymore. She lives in Los Angeles and she said, you know what? You're getting your inheritance early. I'm passing this apartment on to you. So this is the apartment where I lived as a little girl. It's in a part of Budapest called Józsefváros, and it's right next to this really beautiful old museum called the Nemzeti Museum, which is the Museum of America, Museum of American History. It's the Museum of Hungarian History, right? And I'm in the U.S. right now, so my brain I'm in U.S. brain. I have to transfer
Do
to
the switch.
Hungarian brain, right? So the Nemzeti Museum, and I was walking down the street right in front of my apartment building. I was headed home, and there was this old woman, and she looked exactly like the old woman in the story.
Oh,
The description is absolutely accurate. And she just walked up to this planter. There are planters that the city maintains in the street.
mhm.
And she had a little plastic bag and she ripped up a plant and she put it in her plastic bag and she just toddled off. And I was like, what? What was that? What just happened? And somehow or other, over the next few days, I kept thinking, what is going on? Why with this little old woman? And she really was white-haired little old woman. Why would she go around with plastic bags stealing flowers from these city planters? Yeah, that's where the story came from.
Amazing. What was the easiest part of writing the story, and what did you find to be the most difficult thing?
Well, this particular story, it felt pretty easy, and that doesn't always happen, but this one kind of flowed. It kind of felt like it was just coming out, and I don't know, I think that old woman just inspired me. So it was easier than most short stories. I just sat down, I started writing, and it seemed to sort of flow out of me, which is really nice. The one thing that was a little bit difficult, I mean, it wasn't too difficult, but I start talking in the story about the history of Hungary and going way back in history to Pannonia, because Hungary used to be part of Pannonia. Pannonia was a Roman district. And doing that research, it was a little bit hard finding information online.
Mm.
That was a little bit tricky. But other than that, this one was particularly easy. And I'm not sure why. I think, maybe she cast a spell on, maybe she was a magical old woman who cast a spell on the story. There are things that are hard for me in writing, especially plotting, but this one came out easy and I'm grateful.
So did you actually find out things about flora? Is the flora stuff all that?
Yeah. I absolutely did. I mean, there's some things I made up, but Flora's a real goddess. She's a real Roman goddess.
Yeah.
She really was worshipped in a very serious way. And it's interesting because when we think about Roman mythology, the stuff that comes down to us, the stories, they don't necessarily reflect the daily lives of the Romans and the way that they behaved in their homes and at rituals. So they're goddesses like Flora who don't have major mythology about them. So we don't tend to, they don't make it into, she's not in Rick Riordan as far as I know. I mean, maybe she is. I haven't read all those books, but
Right.
They don't have major stories about them. And yet in the actual ritual life of the Romans, many of these gods and goddesses were very important. So Hestia or Vesta, she would be another
Right.
example where she was very, very important as a goddess of the hearth. But yeah, trying to get that history, like the real history, as opposed to just the stories, that can be a little bit tricky.
You write both brilliant prose and gorgeous poetry. And we just
Thank
published
you.
one of your poems
It's very
last
nice
month.
of you to say.
What draws you to each form, and what is the most challenging aspect of each for you?
Poetry. I think I love writing poetry because I love playing around with language. So writing for me is a little bit like getting to play. It's a joy. It's what I love doing. One of the things I love doing most in the world. And poetry is really playing around with language. And you asked about the most challenging part. I think the most challenging part in poetry it's funny because it can take me as long to write a poem as it takes to write a short story, strangely enough.
Oh, makes complete sense to me.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
the short stuff is hard, right? Because somehow or other it needs to be a lot more perfect. And if you've got that one word that's not working, you just need to, I mean, I obsess about it. I go back to the poem and I go back to the poem and try to figure out how to make it right. So for poetry, you can feel when it's not as right as it could be. Um, and there's always this kind of tension in a poem. If it's working, there's a tension between what the language wants to do, the form and the content. And if you can find the perfect point of tension, like a ballerina doing a pirouette, then it feels like you've got it right. And then prose, I was thinking about what it is that I like about writing short stories. And I think what I really like is characters, especially in short stories, exploring characters and getting inside their heads. Like in this particular story, I was trying to get inside the head of the woman who stole flowers, but I can't get inside her head because she's not the viewpoint character. And so what I'm really doing is I'm getting inside the head of the viewpoint character who's trying to get inside the head of the other character. And so that being somebody else, getting inside a character's head, that's the most fun, I would say, in short fiction. The hardest thing probably is structure. And as you get longer and longer, for me at least, that becomes more and more challenging. So plotting, especially novel length plotting, I think tends to be quite challenging for me.
So tell us about something you've read, watched, or consumed lately that you'd like to share with our listeners.
I was thinking about the word consumed, and I'm going to say chocolate, but I think mostly you're asking about media.
You can recommend a chocolate too. I'm sure there's plenty of Uncanny listeners who also love chocolate.
Oh, well, I mean, they'd have to go to Hungary is the only problem, because Hungary has the best chocolate in the world. That is only my personal opinion, but come to Hungary for the chocolate. So what I've been doing lately actually is going back to my teenage reading, and I've been reading Anne McCaffrey.
Oh,
have you read the Pern books?
Not in a long time. Not since I was a teenager.
I hadn't either. So when I was a teenager, there were writers that I read all the time. Anne McCaffrey was one of them. I would say Ursula Le Guin, of course, Kenneth Lee, Patricia McKillip. I think Robin McKinley was probably the other one. But I've been going back to some of them, and I'd gone back. I don't even know why I started rereading these, but the Anne McCaffrey Dragon series, the Pern series, I want to recommend them because I realized that I'd forgotten some things. And one is that I had thought of them as much more standard secondary world fantasy than they actually are. And I had forgotten that actually there's a lot of political tension there. And she is looking at political structures and political tension in the way Le Guin was. And we tend not to think of Anne McCaffrey that way. We tend to think, oh, she's just a fun writer. She writes about dragons. And that was kind of the way I remembered her, because that's what I cared about as a 15-year-old. I wanted dragons, right? Mm-hmm. And looking back or going back to these books, I'm realizing first, she's a really good writer. And second, she's doing some really complicated things, even with the dragons, but also with the whole political structure of this world that she's created. So I would say for anyone who doesn't know the Pern books, go back, go read them. And if you haven't read them for a long time, go back and see what you think. But because she's doing very complicated things, or much more complicated things than I remembered at any rate. I would say also I've been rereading Patricia McKillip recently and realizing what a beautiful prose stylist she is. I mean, she writes novels that are poems. And so one of the reasons I want to recommend her is that Tachyon, this wonderful small press that also published my most recent short story collection, her books are coming out again in reprints from Tachyon, and they are beautiful, beautiful books. Plus, you get to enjoy her gorgeous prose. So that's another one that I would definitely recommend. And if you liked Susanna Clark and Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell and Piranesi, if you like that level of really beautiful prose, go read Patricia McKillip, because she's doing very similar things in terms of her prose style. I loved Murderbot. So Murderbot was a lot of fun to read. Recommend that for anybody, of course. But also I really loved the TV series. I thought that was great. There are a couple things that I've seen recently, and funnily enough, so one of the problems with recommending things is that a lot of what I've been reading recently is for work. And so it's been about like the origins of language. And it's fascinating to read, but I don't necessarily want to recommend that to science fiction and fantasy fans. Although actually I think they would like it.
Many would like it, I still think.
Yeah. But so I was watching movies on planes. That's where I get to see some things. And Lisa Frankenstein, which is written.
Yes.
I don't know how many people have seen it. It sort of appeared and then disappeared, but it was written by Diablo Cody. And it's actually really funny and really smart and interesting. And also it's like a blast from the 80s. So if you were around in the 80s, it's a lot of fun to watch. Those fashions come back and the lingo come back. And then there's a murder series that I really like called Ludwig.
Yes.
Which is British. Have you seen it?
Yes, I have. It's great. It's great.
Yeah, it's really smart, really, really good. Yeah, so I think those are some of the ones that I would recommend. The only other thing I would want to add is that whenever I'm tired and whenever I feel like I cannot stand reading anything else, I go back to Agatha Christie. And it's because I love her writing, but also because for writers, she is a masterclass in plot. And it's only when you've reread one of her novels a couple of times that you're like, oh, those are all the clues that I should have picked up on that I did not pick up on. And you can see how intricately she plotted things. And for me, since plotting is hard for me, I go to Agatha Christie and I'm like, I want to see how the master did this.
Yeah, the weird thing is I swear that I read somewhere that she didn't always know that she would reverse engineer.
Yeah, that is dumbfounding for me. Like, did her mind just do this automatically? Was she just really, really good at this? And, she didn't have to worry about writing it all down before.
I mean, apparently, but there was, that's one of those comfort things where I always go. Right now I'm reading the Rebus novels by Ian Rankin, which are all set in Edinburgh. But mystery is kind of my, where I go to relax. But it started with that because when I was 10, I started reading the Agatha Christie books and just, I think my little I read, and then there were none. It was like, oh, this blew my mind.
Yeah.
How did this happen? How did she come up with this?
Those were exactly the same. Those were my comfort reads. And I still remember, even as a kid, things like the Encyclopedia Brown mysteries.
Yes.
When we were very small, puzzles and mysteries were always fantastic.
No, that was the first section in the library I was hitting hard right before science fiction. It was mostly mystery and then kind of shifted. And then, of course, you could tell how many science fiction writers, especially the golden age, were also reading mysteries and making, because it is such an easy way to hang a science fiction plot together, is to use that kind of structure of a mystery.
Yes,
for your
and
ideas.
Actually, Lee Child had an article. I'm trying to remember where it was published, and I'm not going to remember correctly, but it was something like the New York Times or the New Yorker. But he had an article where he said, I'm known as a suspense writer, and I only know one way to write suspense. And it's that you always need to have the reader not know something, but want to know it. So at every point in your book, you need to make sure that there's something the reader does not know, but wants to know. And so in a way, the murder mystery plot is just paradigmatic, but it's like the basis of all suspense, right? All plotting is trying to get the reader to go, wait, I need to keep reading because I want to find out what happens next.
Yeah, and certainly in science fiction, where so much of it, especially the bigger ideas stuff, you don't want an engineer just saying, I will now talk for 200 pages about these ideas that have built our society. You want some reason for someone to be exploring through and learning a little bit more with you, and then bringing you to that, keeping that suspense going to drag you through all the cool concepts and ideas.
Yeah, and that's a hard thing to do as a writer, right?
Yes.
That's our job.
Well, it was such a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful speaking with you too. I'm so glad we had this chance to talk.
Thank you, Space Unicorns, for once again listening to the Uncanny Magazine podcast. We couldn't do it without all of you, whether you are a patron on Patreon, back a Kickstarter of Uncannies, get subscriptions from Waitlist Books, or just go around spreading the good word about all the things you love about Uncanny Magazine. But we certainly couldn't do it without the greatest staff in the universe! Featuring Managing Editor Monty Lin, Poetry Editor Betsy Aoki, Podcast Producers Erika Ensign and Steven Shapansky, Podcast Readers Erika Ensign and Matt Peters, Interviewer Carolyn M. Yoakum, Assistant Editor Tanya Chen, and all of our submissions readers. Until next time, shine on, Space Unicorns! Nay!
The Uncanny Magazine podcast theme is courtesy Null Device. Want to join the Space Unicorn Ranger Corps? You can find poetry, stories, and non-fiction every month in Uncanny Magazine. Go to uncannymagazine.com or subscribe to the ebook version at waitlistbooks.com. Uncanny Magazine podcast, copyright Uncanny Magazine.